Now, oh, that's the Zoom. No. There we go. Can you see us?
Are you happy? Can you see us?
Yep, we can see you. If you just want to share your screen, Martin.
Sorry, share screen.
It shouldn't be that. Where is it? This one? I can't see it.
Oh.
That's the one, and we should be able to see that.
Brief moment while we sort things out.
Let's try that. Ah, there we go.
Are we okay now? Yes. Well, greetings from deep southern Tuscany. We're in Savannah, which some of you may know because if you recall Michelle Spike's lectures, you recall that the bosom pal of Matilda of Canossa was the then Pope, Gregory VII. He was born on the hills I can see over to my right, exactly 1,000 years ago this year. Alas, he's been sitting in his cathedral, or at least what's left of him, for a whole year and has been practically not visited. It's such a shame. We were going to put on all sorts of music, but it's not been possible. Anyway, back to today's work. Good afternoon to everybody, and thank you to the Church's Conservation Trust for asking me to talk today. It's really great to see so many people who are interested in medieval churches who are joining us today. What I'm going to try to do is this, to take you back in time, not 1,000 years, but just 500, to come with me to look at an ordinary day in an English village church building. The church building isn't based on any particular place, but we're going to see what went on inside it and outside it and around it. Its plans and furnishings are, though, based in every detail on what we have found during nearly 10 years research in churches all over England and Wales. I'm going to show you who were there 500 years ago, what they did, and where, when, and how they worked and worshipped during the course of that single day. And I hope to be able to show you that they were able to do these things because they were helped to do them by the design of the church building, the placing of its windows, and its acoustic design. I'm going to tell you the story of that day using some of the characters that would have been found in and around the church. To make the story more human, I hope, I've given them names. On the plans, these characters are color-coded too, so that I hope you can follow their movements. The church clock bell will remind you of the time of day, and the churchyard and church plans will show where the sun is in relation to the church building and what it can light up. And you'll see on the screen, Wilder Parsonage on the bottom right, and Harry the Sexton's house up there on the left in green. So if you follow purple for Will, you'll see green also for Harry. So here we go. The church clock in the tower has just sounded for the first time today. It's 6 o'clock and still quite dark. Any sunlight is just a pale hint in the sky. Harry the sacristan, known to everyone as Harry the Sexton, is already in the church and rings the Angelus bells from the floor in the West Tower. While the Angelus is being pealed, William the parish priest sets off, walking briskly from his house on the edge of the churchyard towards the chancel door, saying the Angelus prayer to himself, Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with you. Meanwhile, Harry's son has work to do on the rood loft. He goes up a narrow stairway onto the rood loft and lights a small taper from the wax candle which burns all the time below the high crucifix. With this, he lights the 6 floating candle wicks in the basins which are placed along the front parapet of the loft. They're basins of oil, ordinary natural oil, vegetable oil. And those 3 extra basins on each side are in front of the statues of Mary and John. Then carefully carrying the taper, he goes back down the loft stairway arrives at the chancel door.
We've had a blip.
Slight blip.
Hi, Martin. I think we just lost you for a second there. If you want to share your PowerPoint again, as we've just lost you briefly. So if you want to re-share your PowerPoint.
Yeah. Just trying. Which one are we on?
Is that right? Is that right?
Is that there? Do you have that, George?
Yes.
Good. So we've got to Will the parson, who is just about to come through the chancel door, which you'll see on that plan now, sort of basically to the right. He goes across the chancel to the other side, genuflecting as he passes the sacrament, hanging in its pyx in front of the high altar. In the sacristy, Harry helps Will to put on his vestments, and they then leave the sacristy and pass between the choir stalls to go through the rood screen doors and turn right towards the small altar under the north side of the rood loft. Harry places the chalice in the back of the bowl of the small lavabo cut into the wall near the altar. He opens the shutter of the window to let just a little light in onto this otherwise very dark place. Will stands still for a moment to prepare himself to celebrate the morrow mass of daybreak. 3 people who've come to hear mass are sitting on some benches, just loose ones near this morrow mass altar. They're dressed warmly, not only because it's quite cold in the church, but also because they're about to go with some of their farm produce to the weekly market in a town 4 miles away. So they wish to have the comfort and protection of hearing mass before they leave. 20 minutes later, the short said mass is ended, and Will the parson returns to the sacristy. Harry the sexton locks the rood screen and then goes home through the south porch door for breakfast. But Will still has work to do. He takes off his mass vestments and puts on a heavy dark brown choir cloak with a fur collar. Then he goes back through the choir stalls to his seat on the south side of the choir. He sits there for a few moments facing the high altar with his back to the rood screen. And you see him, the purple blob, in the choir. The daily office book, which is part of the Chancellor's library, is kept in a small stob or cupboard in the corner between the seats to his right. He leans over and finds a small breviary, and then he rises to open the shutter at the bottom of the nearby window, so he can see the special day prayers for the day by the first light of the rising sun. Standing up, he sings, Deus in adjutorium meum intende, and will once more start the daily rounds of offices with the combined office of Matins and Lords, which he chants quickly in a low, quiet singing voice. Today, the 26th of November, in the 11th year of the reign of King Henry VIII, is not a feast day. It's just an ordinary working day, a ferial one, in the year of our Lord, 1520. 25 minutes later, Will gets up out of his seat, having rested there a short while after being on his feet for so long. Turning round and looking through the rood screen, he sees he has 2 silent companions. One is Marjorie, an older widow woman, well known for her good works around the parish. The other is Alison, a younger, unmarried and well-educated woman who was recently elected to be one of the church wardens. She reads from her own prayer book during the office. Both leave the church while Will returns to the sacristy. Soon after, the clock bell chimes again, and it is 7 o'clock. In the sacristy, Will checks that everything for the high mass of the day is ready. He locks the sacristy door and leaves through the chancel door, locking that behind him as well, and returns to the parsonage. Once home, he takes a quick drink of small ale and sets light to some kindling wood in the kitchen stove. Then he goes straight upstairs to the oratory over the south porch, which overlooks the garden, to say the short office of prime. This is much less complicated than the earlier office of Matins and Lords. It consists of responses and prayers and 3 psalms, which change every day, so that he sings or says all of the 150 psalms every week. Will knows these by heart and needs to consult his personal small breviary only for the special collect for today, Thursday before Advent. Will says quietly to himself the opening phrase of this and every office, Deus in adjutorium meum intende. And 12 minutes later, prime is finished. Will goes downstairs and out of the back door to the privy to relieve himself. Now he can break his overnight fast. Since he has not yet sung the high mass, he doesn't eat any meat. So warming up some sheep's milk on the stove, he dunks pieces of yesterday's bread into it. The clock bell chimes while Will is eating an apple and thinking how he can manage the rest of the day. He's expecting 2 visitors. One is a priest that Will hopes will help him with an increasing workload. Extra pressure on his time has come especially from those requesting sung chantry masses for the souls of their recently departed relatives. The other person he is expecting to see today is the organ maker. He's due to come and check over and tune the organ in good time for Christmas. Will wonders if an assistant priest might also be able to play the organ. That would save having to find an organ player in the nearest town for the feast days around Christmas. Just as Will was cleaning his beaker and platter and thinking about going outside for some more firewood, there's a knock on the street door. Dressed in a thick overcoat, a young man is standing outside. Greeting him by name, Will invites Thomas to enter in. Stooping slightly to step through the doorway, Thomas takes off his fur-lined hat and reveals his clerk's tonsure. Thomas had lodged in the Friary in the local market town overnight, so he's very happy to accept some of the same milk and bread for his breakfast. While they're talking, Will mentions that either Father or Master Arnold are due to come today to tune the choir organ. Thomas surprises him by saying that he knows the Arnold family well. The clock bell strikes 9 times, so it's the hour for terce, the next office. Will invites Thomas to join him in the oratory. After terce has been said, Will then asks Thomas to help him at high mass, and when they are ready, they set off for the chancel door. Harry the sexton, meanwhile, has returned to the church through the west door in the tower and has wound up the clock. Then going to the sacristy, Harry takes 2 small bottles with wine and water in them and carries them to the lavabo in the sanctuary. Then he takes the mass books from their locker and sets the altar books on their cushions on the high altar and places the epistle and gospel books on their desks. Finally, he lights the 2 candles on the altar, the epistle side first, of course. Harry returns to the tower and starts to peal for mass by chiming the 3 middle bells of the 5 tower bells. Within a few moments, or minutes rather, about a dozen women and a few older men, including one of the church wardens, are gathering in the church. They stand in the church or sit on movable forms. Everyone has positioned themselves to see and hear what's about to take place. There's a short period of silence when Harry stops chiming. So as not to disturb the congregation, he leaves by the west door and passing by the churchyard cross, he goes through the chancel doorway and into the choir. There he puts on a surplice that he's left on one of the choir stalls, and he picks up a high crucifix kept there and goes to the sacristy door. Followed by Thomas wearing deacon's vestments and Will in priest's vestments, Harry leads them to the short distance from the sacristy to the sanctuary. Thomas carries the chalice and places it on its shelf in the lavabo on the south side of the sanctuary. He then takes his place near the stone seats next to the lavabo, while Harry returns to the choir stalls. From the step in front of the high altar, Will begins mass by singing Dominus vobiscum, and Thomas and Harry reply, Et cum spiritu tuo. Later on, Thomas sings the epistle from the wooden desk near the stone seats. And then Will sings the gospel from the brass eagle on the other side of the altar. At this time in the morning, both are glad of extra light from the 3 new sanctuary windows, because chanting the epistle and gospel had become much more complicated in recent years. No longer is it just a question of singing them in a near monotone, but each phrase now needs its special inflections. Turning to face the east window, by now not as bright as it had been an hour before when light was streaming directly through it, they sing the creed. This is also sung with musical elaboration. So they need the extra light to read this. The sounds they make reflect the way in which it's written down in the illuminated mass books, with decorated initial letters and final flourishes. Credo in unum Deum. After that's done, the two priests gather together at the lavabo and mix together the wine and some of the water in the chalice, pouring these from the small bottles that were placed next to the chalice on the lavabo shelf. Thomas then pours a little water over Will's fingers while he says, lavabo in innocentia manus meus et cicuibo altare tuum Domine. I will wash my hands in innocency, and so will I go to your altar, O Lord. Harry now unlocks the sanctuary veil and lets it hang down from the veil beam. The two priests, now hidden behind the veil, start the canon, the central part of the Mass, by responding, Dominus vobiscum, et cum spiritu tuo. The most sacred part of the Mass continues in almost complete silence, with Will singing its words very quietly. Only Thomas is near enough to hear and respond. Thomas rings the small sanctuary bells so that Harry can respond by pulling a rope from his place in the choir stalls to chime the Sanctus bell up on the peak of the rood above them. At the Sanctus, there are 3 spaced strokes of the bells. Sanctus, 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 Deus Domine. The Sanctus bell alerts those working at home on their looms or in their kitchens or gardens, or further away on their strips in the fields. These 3 strokes tell them that the central part of the Mass is underway. Then at the 3 more rapid strokes of the bells at each consecration, they kneel if they can. Those in the church who have been waiting attentively for this moment watch for the elevation of the host and then the chalice over the veil. You can see the veil in that previous picture. Then, on the right there, then Harry passes the pax and a cloth to wipe it through the rood screen so that people in the church can kiss it and say, Pax tecum, and receive the reply, et cum spiritu tuo, before passing it on. The clock bell strikes 10 times. Mass finishes quickly with priest communion, the ceremonial washing of the chalice, and the paten in the lavabo, while Harry raises the veil and the final chants. But Mass is not yet quite complete. Will goes to the north side of the altar. Set in the north wall, there is a small desk with a single page of writing on it. Facing this, he intones the last gospel. The first verses of the Gospel of St. John. In principio erat verbum. In the beginning was the word. Et verbum erat apud Deum, et Deus erat verbum. Et verbum caro factum est, et habitavit in nos. And the word was made flesh and dwelt among us. Et vidimus gloriam, eius gloriam, quasi unigenitea patre, plenum gratiae et veritate. After unvesting in the sacristy, the 2 priests leave Harry to put the Mass vestments back into their breasts and to lock the altar books and chalice and paten back into their stocks. Will and Thomas set off for the parsonage. On their way there, they see a man tying up his horse at the eastern churchyard gate, and they go to greet him. It's Master Arnold, the younger organ maker. He had heard the consecration bells while on his way. Having spurred his horse on, he is grateful for Will's suggestion that they should all go to the church house to have a drink of light ale, together with the church folk who had been present during the Mass. His horse would be equally grateful for a drink from the water trough and a bucket full of oats from the church store. At the church house, Arnold is welcomed by Robert, the other church warden, who thanks him for his pains in riding the 15 or so miles from his workshop. Will talks with his parish folk and introduces Thomas to them, and then they return to the parsonage. Robert the warden goes with Master Arnold to the church to find Harry and to sort out what needs to be done to the organ. Harry is still working in the sacristy, so he opens the door to the staircase which leads to the loft over the sacristy. All three go up to see what condition the bellows and their mechanisms are in. The organ was last played on All Hallows Day at the beginning of the month, and there is a problem because Harry's son was finding it hard work to keep the bellows full of air. Arnold was not surprised. With winter coming on and harvesting done, there's usually an invasion of hungry field mice hoping to make nests and chew the tasty skins on the bellows, which are greased with some tallow fat to make their leather supple. And sure enough, small teeth marks are visible on the bellows, even when they're lying flat. You can see some bellows in the picture on the left there, rather big modern ones. The earlier bellows are more like forge bellows. We couldn't actually find a picture of a pair of them, but there always have to be two or more. Anyway, on raising the bellows and inspecting them carefully, Arnold finds there are two small holes in one of them and a much bigger hole in the other one. Arnold, as you see on the right, had brought with him a glue pot and glue with various wide-headed nails and a couple of square feet of flexible cow leather. He needs some boiling water in the outer pot of his glue pot to remelt and heat up the glue. So he asks Harry to go over to the church house with the pot to heat it up on the fire in the meeting room. It is 11 o'clock. While Harry is away to heat up the glue pot, Arnold goes with Robert to the organ loft. From the sacristy loft, through a doorway which had been made between the uprights of an old window. This window had otherwise been blocked up when the sacristy had been enlarged and its loft built up about 50 years ago. Lifting the cover over the keys, Arnold checks for any mouse droppings between them. He sits down on the organ bench and plays up and down the keys to see if any of them sticks down. One does. So he grasps it and the key next to it and pulls and pushes them up and down and grinds away the droppings into powder to free the key. Robert watches him attentively in case he has to do that himself. Arnold then checks the iron stop levers to the right of the keyboard to see if they are working properly, and then cleans the area around the organ keyboard and the floor below. Robert leaves to go to his home in the village. And when Harry returns, Arnold is back in the sacristy loft. He has cut out 3 pieces of leather and got out some tacks to help the glue hold better in this damp weather. He repairs the bellows quickly before the glue cools down. The leather patches over the 2 small holes did not need any reinforcement, but the larger piece at the neck of the other bellows did. So he backs a few nails in. The glue will have to be left to dry. So Harry suggests that Arnold should go back to the church house to eat. They're brewing the strong Yuletide ales today, as well as baking there. So there are various people around to share whatever each had brought along for their midday meal. The sun has now got as high as it will in the grey sky, and the clock bell strikes 12. Then Harry chimes the second tower bell 3 times, and then 3 more after a pause. And he chimes the 4th bell 7 times, and the 2nd bell 3 times again, and then goes home. In the parsonage oratory, the 2 priests say the Hail Mary together. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Hail Mary, full of grace. And they follow this by saying the short office of Sext. Then at last, it's time for their midday meal. A hot pot made from their own pork and garden root vegetables. Meg, the good woman who cooks for them, has also brought over some freshly baked bread from the church bakehouse. And as a special pre-Advent treat, to go with some hazel and cob nuts, Meg has also brought in 4 small sugary cinnamon cakes. Lunch is washed down with some light ale, also fresh from the church brewhouse. 1 o'clock chimes, and it's now time for a rest. So Will suggests that Thomas should use a small truckle bed in the second bedchamber, the guest bedchamber. After a short nap, Will gets up, puts on his wooden clogs and goes out to the garden, where he usually spends about an hour digging and weeding every day, or when he can. When Thomas appears after a longer rest, Will asks him to help bring in part of a felled ash tree. Together they saw and split its wood with a broad axe, talking as they work. 2 o'clock is chiming while Thomas tells Will about how he was educated in his hometown. He says, I started when I was 6 on the first form in the choir and learnt all the psalms and canticles by heart. When I was first ordained as a junior clerk, when I was 7, I moved upwards into the front choir stalls. I was 14 when my voice changed, and then I sang the second line in written music and learnt how to play the organ. And that's why I know the Arnold family. I was taught at the grammar school run by the parish guilds. They gave me an exhibition which paid for me to go to the large county college when I was 18, because I had chosen to be trained as a senior clerk in holy orders before my ordinations. I'm now looking for a teaching position, but I know full well that I have to start modestly in the priestly life because I'm not from a wealthy family. We'll ask Thomas if he would like to lead the singing at this afternoon's Vespers to make it more solemn with more music. He added that if the church wardens and guild aldermen were satisfied with his work, Will would arrange with them to pay Thomas an annuity. Perhaps he thought they might pay the rent of a house for him to live in too. Three o'clock chimes, and with the sun already beginning to move towards the cloudy horizon, it's time for Will and Thomas to say nones in the oratory before they prepare for Vespers. The late afternoon office of Vespers is due to start at any time after 3:30, when the parish folk can come in from their fields. When the 2 priests walk back to the sacristy to prepare for the office, this is what they hear. They hear sound from the organ as they go to the door. They're tuning it. A discreet cough from Will as he passes across the council warns player and tuners it's time to stop for a while. Robert and Arnold go with Harry's son over to the church house to warm up their cold bones, passing the parish folk who are coming along to the church. Harry starts to peal for Vespers on the 2nd and 4th bells. Today, Vespers is going to be sung solemnly in the wide arch-vaulted and acoustically resonant Lady Chapel. It had been built jointly by the various parish guilds onto the south side of the church only about 25 years ago, at about the same time as the rector paid for the sanctuary to be extended with its own new east windows. The Lady Chapel was designed and built in the latest style for elaborate musical ceremonies, especially for the Masses and Vespers of Our Lady. So it has its own set of lavabo and stone seats. And the chapel is positioned deliberately so that when the sun's in the southwest at Vespers time, as you see on the diagram, its beams of light come through the chapel's wide and tall windows and light up every carved and painted corner of it. Harry stops pealing and rings the Angelus while the church people settled themselves in the Lady Chapel. Magnificat anima Dei mea Dominum. Being a solemn ceremony, today's office of Vespers will take longer than usual because it will include more music, including special antiphons and hymns. The 2 priests process to the Lady Chapel in their wide, lavishly embroidered choir copes. The church bell, clock bell, strikes 4, and the priests begin Vespers. It's quickly apparent that Thomas's training is adequate to all musical demands. He leads confidently from one psalm, antiphon, and hymn to the next, carefully managing their changes of tone. At the end of the office, as the sunlight begins to fade, Thomas sings his favorite love song to Our Lady. Lady be thou heaven a queen, folkes pro and endless bliss, mother and remed and maiden clean, speech in world none other needs. On thee it is well seen, of all the women thou hast that prize. My sweet levity, hear my being, and rule of me with thy Robert and his fellow churchwarden Alison are present at Vespers and can hear Thomas's skill for themselves. So while folk gather after the office in the South Alley, where the Lady Altar used to be, we'll ask the churchwardens to pay Thomas an earnest shilling, which will seal their bargain that he should serve the church for a year in the first place. Then they notice that Master Arnold is standing nearby. He says that he has one more set of pipes to amend. This will not take long, since these are trumpet-like regal pipes that are quick to tune. And since Arnold has almost finished his work and needs to get off to go home again soon, the wardens confer and agree. Then unlocking the door and going up the stairs to the rood loft above the south porch, Robert unlocks the parish chest and brings down 2 shilling coins. Alison gives Thomas his earnest shilling with a little smile, and Robert gives the other shilling to Master Arnold to pay for his fee. The organ work is finished not long after the clock bell strikes 5. So when Master Arnold and Robert have left, Harry locks up the sacristy. Harry's son goes up to the rood loft and pinches out all the lights there except the perpetual one that stays alight at the foot of the crucifix. Checking that the chancel door is locked, Harry locks the rood screen doors and finally locks the south porch door as they leave the church and go home. As they pass the tower, some last sinking rays of the sun light it up. The work of the church building would normally be finished now, but there's more drama later that evening. Not long after the 6 o'clock chimes, during supper, there was a bang on the street door of the parson's house, and there is Master Smith, who says that his grandmother has been taken very bad by a heart seizure. So the light of lanterns could be seen to move around the chancel as the priests fetch the last sacrament, and as they take it to her along the streets, preceded by Harry ringing a handbell. And as they go, the church clock chimes 7 times. And Harry goes to give, Will goes to give Mistress Smith the last unction at her death. When all is over, they leave the family in the capable hands of Marjorie, the wise woman. On their return, Harry tolls Mistress Smith's knell on the 5th and largest bell 70 times, which is what her family thinks is how old she is. Compline, the last office of the day, when every sleeping person's soul is commended to God, is quietly sung this evening in the little oratory, lit by a single candle, and punctuated by the slow tolling of the knell. Before the ending of the day, Creator of the world, we pray, that with thy wonted favor thou wouldst be our God and keeper now. Both Nell and Compline have run their course before the church clock sounds for the last time at 8 o'clock, the curfew hour. Back in their homes, Harry thinks about getting out the church mattock tomorrow to dig a 4-foot deep pit for old Mistress Smith. Will ponders what he might say about her long life, lived in often turbulent times, at tomorrow's Requiem Mass. Thomas remembers Alison's smile and hopes he will be happy in his new community. Meanwhile, shades of moonlight form ghostly patterns on the tiled floor in Chancelland Church, while echoes of bells glide down the tower, pass through the autumn mists and sink down into the dewy fields. O Father, that we ask be done, through Jesus Christ, thine only Son, who with the Holy Ghost and thee shall live and reign eternally. Amen. Well, there we are. I hope that this brief glimpse of what might have happened in and around the village church, building on a typical day 500 years ago, will have given you an idea of why churches were designed as they were. They are buildings made for daily music, and to make this possible, they and their windows were arranged according to the daily movement of sunlight. Thomas's hometown church, a much larger and more complicated building, would have resounded to music almost continuously from dawn to dusk. Our village churches had a fair share of music today, though, with the 2 sung public services and the High Mass, plus the sounds of the organ being tuned, of course. And tomorrow, there will be 4 sung services, including Mistress Smith's Requiem. On Sunday, there will be a procession before High Mass and a short homily and bidding prayers from the pulpit. And the offices will be longer and more solemn, with more music. And so the daily round goes on, 7 days a week. So next time you're able to visit a church, try and stay there long enough to notice how the size and placing of the windows are aligned with the sun as it moves from the east, across the south, and towards the west of these buildings. Imagine how this reflects the placing and timing of the daily services. If you notice, there was quite a lot of locking and unlocking of doors going on today, and I haven't actually included all the possible times that might have happened. Think too about how richly furnished churches were then, and what temptations they might have presented to commit sacrilege by stealing. Have a look at the outside of windows too, and see if they are barred. Ask yourself, what are they protecting? There was also quite a lot of ringing of bells of all kinds. I'm not sure if that came across. And we need to think about how practical and necessary these sounds were, and how it was so useful for even parish churches of a relatively modest kind to have a clock by this time. That was a clock that merely chimed a bell. It didn't have a dial, of course. Clock is the same word as French cloche, it's bell. It's nothing to do with the mechanism. There are many other details I could have mentioned if I'd had time today, but they all make sense if the daily use of the church building is taken into account. And I'm sure if you take the time to explore these buildings carefully for yourselves, you'll have an even more profound admiration for our ancestors who designed, built, finished, and adorned these unique national treasures, our medieval churches. I've written a short book called ABC of a Medieval Church. See it? Looks quite big next to me. To explain more about what I've said today. And this is available through our research website. The text of the talk will also be published on the website, which is called soundsmedieval.org, soundsmedieval.org, together with the PowerPoints. So the text and the PowerPoints will all be on soundsmedieval.org. So you can have a closer look at these if you'd like to. I'm now writing 2 more books, one on organs in medieval England, and the other on the social, educational, and musical life of parish churches. Well, thank you all for coming with me on this journey today. And a really big thank you to Vicky for sitting next to me, for creating and manipulating those wonderful PowerPoints.
Thank you so much, Martin. That's been fantastic. I'm just going to stop your screen share there. And again, just to echo what you've just said there, everyone watching, you won't have seen Vicky, but she was working very hard behind the scenes, doing a fantastic job helping with the slides. So thank you very much, Vicky. So everyone, we're about to go into question time. So now is the chance for you to put your questions to Martin. So if you've got any burning questions, please do put them away. I know we've had some come in already. But as I said at the start of this lecture, if you're enjoying these, please do consider supporting us in caring for our collection of 356 historic churches. That collection is growing. We always put on these lectures free of charge. We don't charge for them. We record them and they're made available for you to watch free of charge. And we've got lectures now planned right up until April, and we'll be posting details of those shortly. So if you'd like to support us, please do go to our website and make a donation. So that's visitchurches.org.uk. You can text us, so text CCT to 70331 to give us a gift of £3. Or if you think this lecture is worth more than £3, you can text, and I'm just going to give you the correct code here. You can text CCT to 70191, and that will give us a gift of £10. Finally, we're about to go into questions, but finally, as I said at the start, do consider becoming a member of the CCT. If you join us as a member from as little as just £3.50 per month, you will get a free copy of this book. It's fantastic. It's Beautiful Church by Matthew Byrne, has beautiful images in it and some wonderful facts and figures. So we're going to dive straight into question time, Martin. So I'm going to read off some of the ones that have been coming in. There's been some great questions coming in today. And I think, again, before we go into the question, it's really interesting how your presentation has brought to life the parish church. And it's helped a lot of people, and including myself, when we next go to parish church, to really understand how the windows were positioned and imagine the light. I know we were talking the other day, and the average time we spend in a parish church may only be a few minutes, but actually, if back in the days you were saying, people will be staying there a couple of hours possibly at a visit, so you'd really see how the light really has an impact on the building. So thank you for sharing that with us. So the first question we've had come in is, I think it's quite an interesting one. Is there a correct way or order of lighting candles on an altar?
Yes, there is. I was taught it as a boy. And it is actually to light the epistle side first. So if you've got more than two, but two was normal in a medieval church. Lots of churches these days have 6, but you always start at the epistle side. That's as you look at the altar on the right-hand side.
And then it's correct, you'd go onto the gospel side after that, wouldn't you?
Well, you then just go along, yes, the epistle first and then the gospel. So when you then snuff them out, it's the gospel first and the epistle second. There's some symbolism involved there, no doubt.
Thank you. And I know it was really interesting when you were talking about some of the offices and certainly the mass that was said, and you showed that beautiful image of the last gospel stand in the north wall of a church. And
Right.
if anyone watching has been to, if you're an Anglican, if you've been to an Anglo-Catholic mass, if you go to an English Missal mass, which is a translation of the Tridentine mass into English, you'll see that the priest during the gospel goes to the north side of the altar to read the gospel. So it really ties in with all that rich symbolism you've just been talking about, Martin.
Yes, that last gospel, though, is right at the end of the mass. And you don't get it in the Tridentine mass at all.
No, but it's really interesting, isn't it? That at the end of the mass, as you said, it doesn't finish, but you've got this lovely reading, which is quite powerful actually, if you hear that reading.
Very powerful.
You've talked about some of the roles and sort of the lay people involved with the church. We've had a question come in here. How common was it for there to be female church wardens?
It's not terribly common, but they do exist in the records, because we have about 350 church wardens accounts of any size that left from this period, and a number of those do have accounts that are signed off by both men and women. I wouldn't say it's very common. It does happen. And I thought I'd throw it in to try and provoke precisely that question. Thank
you. And we've had some questions here. thank the comments coming in. This is beautifully detailed and full of humanity. So thank you for that, Martin. But what are the sources for this level of detail? For example, the work of an organ maker, possibly looking for mouse droppings, and the priest beyond the daily offices. Are there any particular sources you've drawn from?
Well, the organ making bit is me, of course. Having to mend bellows that have been chewed by mice during the autumn time when they come into the church after harvest. I mean, that is absolutely typical, and many organ builders have to do that. The priests and the officers, it's interesting, all priests, like monks, were supposed to say all the offices every day. In a village church, they tended to say or rather sing, most cases, just matins and vespers in the church, and to say the others in their oratory in the parsonage. In a town church, the whole gang of priests would get together and probably say most of the offices together in the church. But we're talking about absolutely the lowest level of activity possible in a church. Otherwise, this talk would have gone on for 4 hours. In a big church or a collegiate church, something would have been happening every 20 minutes. And it's interesting that in collegiate churches like Ottery St. Mary in Devon, for instance, we know they had a clock right from the beginning in the 13th century, because they had to regulate the time of the services so strictly. The clock would be chiming not just the hours, but probably the quarters and halves as well. Ottery had the extra awkwardness of actually having a parish church attached to it. So the parish churches people were trying to get their services into the cracks between all the other services going on. And eventually, like at Wymondham as well in Norfolk, they built themselves another bit of the church so they could actually have their services relatively undisturbed.
That's really interesting. Thank you for that answer, Martin. Is there, you've talked about the organ, and obviously you've got a huge amount of expertise in building organs. Who would have been pumping the organ bellows? Because you said there may be more than 2 bellows.
No,
Who's been pumping them?
there are 2 bellows, but it's the same person who does both. That's Harry's son. I was going to make a pun on Harrison because that's quite a well-known name in organ building. Not just now, but in the 18th, 17th, and probably 16th century as well. You need 2 bellows because what you do is you lift one and let it sink down under the weights on it, some lead weights on it, and they give air into the organ. And then as that's going down, you lift up the other one, and so that gradually sinks down. So there's a continuous flow of air, but it's the same person who lifts them both. Really big bellows have an actual mechanism, big levers to lift them up. But fairly small ones you can actually do yourself. You just lift them up with a handle on one end. But the way they were arranged in churches is actually still under investigation. And the idea that they were over sacristies in lofts is something we've discovered during our research. We've actually found the hole in the wall between the sacristy loft and where the organ loft was in several churches. And we'll be publishing about that. So we're fairly sure about it. The problem is, of course, both organs have disappeared. And that's largely because they stopped teaching people to play the organ in the 1540s when chantry colleges went down, were confiscated and destroyed. And partly because of terrible times under Elizabeth when there were plagues, lots of inflation, church wardens just sold off everything they possibly could, including eventually the metal of the organs and their cases, just for firewood or for making hen coops or whatever out of them. And so we've forgotten that there were organs in churches, first of all, and there were an awful lot of them. And then because the sacristy lost all its ornaments and vestments during the Reformation and later in the Puritan period as well, after a certain revival, then the sacristies were left to fall down as well. So if you go around to the northeast side of quite a number of churches, it's quite surprising how many ruins of sacristies you'll find. And they were quite big. And the one I've drawn on the plan is not exaggerated. It would have to be that big to contain all the vestments and all the other furniture, the altar furniture, and this, what they call the jewels of the church. And the idea it had a loft with the bellows in, and sometimes a loft actually had the treasury, the really precious things in it as well, because that was locked at the bottom door. And we found churches where there were shutters on the window. They kept the really precious stuff up there with the bellows. There's one church in particular, the first place we found with a wind trunk, in fact, has an easily accessible loft and has shutters on, still has shutters on the windows. It's amazing. And barred windows.
Thanks, Martin. I think people will look forward to reading your research once that's published. You've mentioned on your map at the start, you showed something called a church house. Now, we've had a couple of questions coming in. What is a church house and who lived there?
Nobody lived there. It was the house that was built by the church people, somewhere in the village, usually quite near the church. And in it, they did all their activities, sort of like a parish hall or parish room would be these days. Except that in addition to all the things that you do in a parish room, they baked bread. It was a communal bake oven, very often. And they certainly brewed the church ales. And at this moment, just before Christmas, they're not only brewing the normal light ales, which everyone drank, because you have to boil the water to make ales that makes the water safe to drink. They were brewing the really strong ales, which they used to drink in the 12 days festivities after Christmas. So I'm positing they would have had to do that about 4 weeks before Christmas, which my brewing friends tell me is probably about right.
Brilliant. And for those of you interested in church houses, we're hoping that next year there'll be a lecture about church houses and the links and how they evolved into the local village pub. Now, Martin, I think we've got time for a couple more questions. How do you know the tunes to chant from, which were used in the Middle Ages?
Most of my chants were just simple Gregorian tones, which are the normal psalm tones or the scales at which you sing things and the inflections you give them. The Edi Biodu is in fact a late 13th century song, supposed to be secular, but of course it has a deeply religious meaning, as well as a sort of courtly love type of meaning about it as well, which is gorgeous. The heavenly queen, and pardon me if you will. Very courtly in its feeling. The final hymn of the Compline was, of course, an English translation of one of the Compline hymns, which quite a lot of people might well know, in fact. I used to sing it at school, in fact.
And I think a nice question to finish with, and going back to the music in the chants, so who used the choir stalls and when would the choir stalls be used?
Yes, that's interesting. I drew a lot of choir stalls, and that might have surprised people. I think I drew 22 of them. Now, who used the choir stalls were the people called the choristas, those who worked in the choir. But these aren't necessary, only those people who sing. They would consist of the priest and anybody invited from the high-ups, the rector, for instance, of the church. This church is not a rectory. It has a rectory, has a rector, but the priest is a vicar put in by the rector, who might be some lord or noble or a bishop or a monastery. And if the rector came, he would have the right of sitting in one of the 6 seats that face the altar, returned against the roots screen. And then in the other seats, that would be filled with some singers who would be hired in for great feast days. It would have people from the parish who had been taught to carry candles or the crucifix, or to swing the incense, or to carry what were called the holy water pots. I didn't mention holy water because that's an additional complication, but there were people in larger churches whose sole job was to take holy water around the place and through the church and into the town as well. And they were clerks, ordained clerks, who also had the right to sit in the choir. All these people would sit either on the front seats, there's a rather less complicated seats than the bucket ones at the back, or in the bucket ones at the back. At the far end of the south side of the chancel seats, I drew an extra slightly big one because we found evidence at Stratford-on-Avon that seat, which is still there, was in a sight line to the organ loft and through a little window to the person who would be lifting and moving the bellows. And it's fairly sure that the person there was the rector chori, the conductor of the choir, so that when he stood to sing, the player would know it's time to play, but more importantly, the bellows mover, pumper, would know it's time to fill the organ with wind so that the player could play. so that then they'd sing and the organ would play, they'd sing, the organ would play, and so it would go on alternately.
Brilliant. Well,
So the choir is filled with many more people than one might expect. And that's why English choirs are very big. I mean, look at the size compared between a normal choir and the People's Church, the other side of the rood screen. Very often the choir's as big, at least as long. But the people, of course, would be building up their church as much as they could, adding on aisles, building a bigger tower, adding a lady chapel, etc., etc. But look at the basic plan, and you see that in English churches, choirs are large.
Thank you so much, Martin, for those answers there. And everyone, thank you so much for your questions today. They've been great. If we haven't answered, I am sorry, but we will do our best to try and get answers to you. Now, next week, we go into December, and we've got some real treats for you in December. So next week, and the following week, there's not one, but there are 2 lectures each week. So next Thursday, there are going to be 2 lectures. There'll be one at 1 p.m. UK time. That will be taking place with Dr. Francis Young, who's returning to us to give a lecture on Christmas ghosts. So for those of you who are familiar with the writings of M.R. James, Charles Dickens, he's going to be talking about the history and the evolution of the Christmas ghost story. Then in the evening, if you join us at 7 p.m. UK time, Dr. Emma Wells is returning to lead our annual lecture called Holy and Appropriate, the Secular Uses of Medieval Churches. Then the following week, do join us again for those. So we've got a book launch for you on Monday. So Peter Stanford, TV broadcaster and journalist, has a new book that I think is launching today, actually. And that is called Angels, A History. So if you're interested in about angels, why they're in churches, and sort of, you know, how they're depicted in the Bible and how our thoughts about guardian angels might be a bit off, do join us because he's going to be talking about the history of angels. Then that Thursday, we are joined by Nick Page, who has just launched a new book called Christmas, Traditions, Truth and Total Baubles, where he's going to be looking at ditching some of the fake news around Christmas. So you can find details of all of those upcoming lectures on our Facebook events page, or you can go onto our website, visitchurches.org.uk, where we've got a page dedicated to all of our previous and our upcoming lectures. As I said, we're making a recording of this lecture, so do check our playlists if you want to catch up on any of our previous recordings. But if you've got any ideas for lectures that you'd like us to do, please do comment away. As I said, we've got lectures planned in the pipeline right up to April now, so do comment and we'll try and get some lectures on the topics that you suggest. But once again, thank you very much, Martin, for that fantastic and really insightful talk and giving us a tour around the parish church. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for another lunchtime lecture. We look forward to seeing you next week.